tell Sabis, thank you for debating with me. This has been great. And this speech is for the Mexican debating circuit, as always. I will start in 3, 2, 1. Above all, panel, Sabi and I are representing Pakistan and Mexico because after learning English and being able to participate in these types of opportunities, we communicate with individuals for all over around the world, not only entering a world that is foreign to us, but representing our own identities. That is what learning English is about. That is what we vouch for in this debate. Two key characterizations for the round. First, the characterization of developing countries. Secondly, what would the policy entail? What does this generally look like for schools? The first thing, the two main characterizations that I want to give on developing countries are, one, that they normally have a shortage of opportunities. I think all around the world, particularly in the poorest countries, there are constraints as to the things that people can normally work in. That is, the types of jobs that you can work are normally more limited, but even within the different realms of works or the different areas of works of jobs, I think most individuals can't access certain areas because they have to default to some other things, such as like being either blue or white collar, having blue or white collar jobs depending on the conditions in their country. So maybe you can't participate in certain things because those are only available to English speakers. Secondly, I think these countries are increasingly entering globalization, and this is a trend that will continue in the future. You have a lot more tourism. You have a lot more economic plans with other countries, which means that there's more migration amongst these countries. Education plans are continuously more global. And what this therefore means is our schools would therefore normally have a lot more engagement with these types of trends, and this would most likely look like a couple of things on our side. Most of these classes would probably be given in English, but we still believe that some classes would be given in native languages. So normally in developing countries that already do so, you probably have like 3 classes that are still given in your native language, such as just like the native language in itself, that could be like Spanish, Urdu, whatever it is. You can also have like lit classes, literature classes, things like that. But most of your classes, such as sciences, mathematics, English in itself, would be given in that language. 2 arguments then to forward in the speech. First, why do we believe this is better for the individual, and why do we think this improves their material conditions? At the top, I want to note that we don't believe that people should be constrained to the subjective circumstances of their lives, and particularly of the place in which they were born. I think there is no principled justification as to why, if I were born in a particular country that cannot like give me enough possibilities for me to emancipate myself and advance me and my family, that I should therefore be constrained into that position. I believe that the system should be giving them as many abilities to choose for themselves what they want to do and to be competitive in that. What's the status quo? I think that in the status quo, there are only certain subsets of society, particularly the most privileged ones, who can learn English and can learn them to an extent where they can be actively competitive in the world market. There are 3 problems with this. The first is you just intuitively perpetuate great systems of inequality. That is, certain people that historically can teach their children English, and that's generation over generation, have a lot more advantages over certain groups. And particularly, and this is a second problem, certain communities can be characterized as more ignorant and less capable of developing, particularly because they can't engage with the same material, because they can't access the same opportunities, because they can't travel to the same countries, all because of things that were not under their control, because they just were never taught that. But the third problem is that you have a lot more brain drain. That is to say, when you only have a couple of people that can know these things, they therefore have the incentive of just going to other countries, because you don't, from the get-go, since they're young, build infrastructures where working in different languages with different abilities. For example, I'll address that in a second, are built at home. You have to necessarily go to other places. But importantly, we believe that English gives you more possibilities to advance your material conditions for a couple of reasons. The first is just because these markets are more broad. I think that generally, like, the reason why we choose English is just because this is a universal language. And I want to note that in general, contrary to what opposition may say, does not only mean that you have access to the Western world, but that you can more easily communicate with any opportunity that happens in communities that are very similar to yours. That is, it is more easy for people in Asia to communicate amongst themselves and build inter-country projects that are not necessarily tied to their colonial powers or something that means that they have to give away some of their cultures, but it's rather a person from Japan and China, or person from Thailand and India having collective projects that mean that they're more regionally competitive. I think that's a type of perspective that we also have. But for the individual, this also means they have a multiplicity of options that they can choose. I think that insofar as you can choose more, like you have a more availability of jobs, therefore the types of lives that you have are not defined by constraints and by like you having no other option, but rather sometimes as a more active choice. Why do we therefore have the best of both worlds? And this framing that will be relevant until the last speech in this debate. We would like why, and this answers the question of why does it have to be the primary language? We believe that in the status quo, overwhelmingly, English or any foreign language, when it is not taught as a primary language, is normally not taught seriously. And this entails a couple of things. Normally, these schools, just because they want to offer a foreign language, have teachers that in many instances don't speak good English, you don't have good textbooks, and you're not really taking these opportunities as seriously for these students. Therefore, the students don't necessarily see this as opportunities for growth, but just as an extra class that they have in school that they have to go through. Generally, the characterization is they just give you some videos that have to do with English. You watch movies in English, but you don't really develop. Therefore, why do we think that doesn't happen the other way around? That is, opposition can come up and say, now you're going to do that with your native language. But there is like 3 reasons why that doesn't happen. The first is because this is a language you care for from the get-go. I think culturally and socially, this is a language that you feel more comfortable with because you're the one like that, whether like your native language, I mean, because it is the one that basically is tied to your identity. This is a language that you were born speaking in, or like that they taught you when you first started speaking. And there's also the language that you overwhelmingly speak, with which you build your social relationships, the language that you use when you go to church, when you talk to your family, when you consume media such as movies and things like that. Therefore, when you go into that class, you also have a lot more infrastructure. So even if it's just 1 or 2 classes, that being the native language as a secondary language, it's still probably with a native speaker for sure. A person who knows that they have more limited hours, but they have to teach you. And what's the worst case scenario? You won't have to teach them as much. So less hours is probably not a big deal, because it doesn't really matter if you're not completely an expert on the rules on your own language, as long as you know how to read it, speak it, write it, etc. That is not the same with other languages. You have to deconstruct that language in order to fully understand it. Secondly, why this is better for cultural and social relationships? I think that countries and these countries, developing countries, are culturally and socially and academically excluded from the world. From the world. In most instances, these people cannot access the same books, cannot write for the same publics and audiences. And the reason why this matters is our side of the house means that these people can exponentiate their cultures on a higher plane. That is, I can talk about Mexico on a world plane, I can express our views, and therefore have a lot more international interactions. You can fight lasting nationalistic narratives that make it so that like governments can constrain these people and basically fix their possibilities and their preferences based on the idea that you should speak your language as a means to be able to be part of the state. I think you are only completely emancipated and part of a culture when you have the possibility of opting out. For all of those reasons, very clear, it will be a very clear win for side government.
I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Let's have the leader of opposition whenever they are ready. Shasha.
Can I just get a confirmation that I'm audible?
Indeed, you are.
Okay, great. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. England has already colonized half the world. Will not also let them colonize the language. Very proud to stand on a wall. 4 main points in my speech. Firstly, some rebuttal and contextualization, but the majority of the rebuttal will be integrated in my content. Firstly, I'll talk about the importance of culture and how language is tied to culture. Second of all, I'll talk about worse job opportunities which happen on their side of the house. Thirdly, I'll talk about worse social mobility. But firstly, onto the points of rebuttal and contextualization. 3 things here. Firstly, please do note that government has to prove to you that English as a general language is so that as a general language of instruction in school is so detrimental for the global market that it stifles like the needs, for the cultural development, right? We believe that English knowledge is only necessary in like specific fields and for specific jobs, but still the majority of the jobs you'll still need to know the primary language, right? I'm going to talk about that more later. Second of all, please do note that people still learn English in schools as a foreign language, right? And if you buy into the characterization of OG when they tell you that they teach English bad, how exactly would they comparatively be so good at teaching like specific subjects in English as well, right? If the English classes are already bad, how will the science or math or chemistry in English necessarily be good and something that the people will learn, right? We don't see how that happens. Thirdly, please do note that like importance of English as the global language is decreasing, right? As the different countries in the world gain a lot of soft power in the international sphere, their languages are also becoming increasingly important, right? We believe that these are languages such as Chinese, etc., but also a lot of countries also prefer people to be speaking their own first language rather than speaking English, right? These are countries such as France and the Netherlands, right? So the importance of English is not as big as they're trying to portray. Now moving on to my first point, where I'll talk to you about culture, right? Firstly, let's let's talk about why culture is important. 3 things here. Firstly, we said that culture is inherently tied to individual's identity, right? How you perceive the world, how you grew up, and who you are as a person is inherently tied to your culture, how your parents raised you, and the people you're surrounded with. Secondly, we also said it's inherently tied to your family and your ancestors, right? The majority of the bonds which exist for you as a child to the outside world, and the majority of close familiar relationships you have with people are built through the culture you were raised in, right? But secondly, we said that just in general, as a value, cultural plurality is something that's extremely important, right? And note that language is an extremely important aspect of culture, because a certain culture is expressed through that language, right? It's expressed through the way they perceive language, through the way they speak, and through the ways they communicate, right? So the point at which you erase a language, you're also erasing a big crucial part of the future, right? And this is exactly what happens when the primary language of instructions in schools is English instead of being the national language, right? Because we said that people age, just they will speak their language for comparatively less time, right? They will not speak in schools for the majority of the time. That's how their language eventually gets lost in them, right? They become worse at speaking it. They become worse at the nuances of it and stop appreciating the beauty of it. And consequently, also the culture, which is also in our minds inherently tied to the language, right? And their knowledge becomes less nuanced. And we said this is extremely problematic because we're taking away the culture from the people and we are erasing a part of their identities, right? So that's why culture is something that's extremely important and it's being erased on the government side of the house. But secondly, let's talk about worse job opportunities, right? We said that with English being a primary language of instructions, they get worse job opportunities on 2 levels. Firstly, getting a job in their home country, and secondly, even getting a job outside comparatively is still worse. Firstly, why getting a job in a home country opportunities are worse, right? We said that the majority of jobs that exist within the home country of every single individual person are still jobs that necessitate you to know the language of the country that you speak, right? These are jobs in the public sector, right? Whether you we work in the government and you work with laws, those laws are written in your country's language, right? Whether you work in a store and need to communicate with people on a day-to-day basis, you need to do that in your own language, not a foreign language, right? Whether you work in the medical sector and also communicate with people, you need to speak your own language and not a foreign language, right? So comparatively, those people will be less prepared to actually work those jobs, right? And opportunity for children who will be taught who will be taught English instead of their national language will be comparatively worse. But also, second of all, in English-speaking countries, right? We said that we said 3 things here, right? There's three reasons for that. We say that firstly, their education that they get in their home country will always be perceived as worse compared to those people who got it in, for example, someone who goes from Serbia, which is a developing country, and wants to work in the US, their education, even if they got the education at the best schools in Serbia, will still be perceived as comparatively worse to someone who, for example, went to Yale, right? But also their knowledge will be worse because it will not be taught in a language that is own to them, a language they understand on a sort of intimate basis, but it will be taught in a language that is ultimately foreign to them, right? So they're not only that they will be perceived as worse, but also their knowledge will be comparatively worse, right? So even if they get to the point of a job interview, they'll still likely perform badly at that job interview because their knowledge will not be as good if they'll not be taught in the language in which they learn how to process emotions and process the world. Second of all, we tell you that that also in the long-term countries, if we teach English as a language of instructions, countries also have a worse chance for further development, right? This is simply because this will insinuate that you need to move out. If you're already taught in a language that the majority of the people in your country do not speak, you will be forced in a way to move out of your countries, which means that the people who are the most educated will go out and find jobs outside of the country, which means that there will be a huge brain drain of intelligent people, of capable people going out of the country. So development of the countries is also worse, right? Now, thirdly, let's talk about why this worsens social mobility, right? Please do note that people who can afford to learn English well enough to be able to understand science, for example, in it, are upper class people, right? Why is that so? Firstly, because upper class people in general already have an advantage and a higher knowledge of English and already have more content with English because they can maybe afford to travel, or simply because just because they're richer and have more opportunities to travel, etc., etc. So they have a better chances at learning English in the first place, right? But also, second of all, richer people can enable their students to richer parents can enable their children to have tutoring in English. They can enable them to maybe go on an exchange for half a year to learn English, right? So the people who will be the best at not only one language, but all of the classes in school will be the richer people, right? And this lessens the social mobility, which is already a huge issue in developing countries where you have people who are disgustingly rich and people who are super, super poor. But now when you make a language of instruction English, which majority of people cannot really afford to learn, have no abilities to learn, you worsen that even more, right? Which means that you enable the poor people to stay poor and rich people to only get richer and richer as they richer and richer and prosper more, because they'll get better grades comparatively, not because they're smarter necessarily, but because they have more opportunities to learn English, which is the language that schools are being taught in, right? And because of all of that, because we believe that you're erasing the culture on government side, because we believe that social mobility is worse, and because we believe that those people have worse job opportunities, vote AWO.
Yep, I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we have the DPM whenever they are ready?
Say that it's start having.
Let me just have a drink of water. Am I audible?
Indeed, you are.
Starting my speech. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At the very top of the speech, opposition has a problem with Britain imposing its language on its colonies, right? Principally. We think it's even more illegitimate for you to colonize a bunch of countries all across the world, and then after you impose a certain English language on them, you don't let them reap the benefits of that certain language. We think that's a principally inconsistent idea that they begin with, right? But we think that just starting rebuttals from the very basic idea, we think that they mischaracterized and didn't deal with any of the exclusive benefits of English that we told you here, right? First idea here. We think that the first rebuttal that they gave to us, that you only need English for certain amounts of jobs in the market and you don't need it for all sorts of jobs. We think that's true, right? That's okay. You don't need English for all jobs. But we also told you that the specific kinds of jobs that enhance your social mobility are overwhelmingly in English across developing countries. Jobs that require you to communicate with clients, jobs that require you to communicate professionally, even especially in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and overwhelmingly across the world, because the world is now much more globalized. So we don't think that they refute any of the harms that we told you. But also, in terms of teaching and the whole idea of that you're not teaching English as well, right? We think firstly, it's important to understand that we never said that English is going to solve like these countries' educational problems in one night. We think that this is going to be a transition into a much better education system that you have today. And the characterization that Manuel gave you was that in current circumstances, in most developing countries, English is taught in a very half-baked manner. That means that you don't have ample opportunities to communicate with friends, to communicate with teachers, and the majority of the time is seen as communicating in English as a foreign language that you're supposed to learn and you're just supposed to get a grade in, which means that students don't absorb the communicative value of English, which means that going down the line when they graduate, they are not able to converse professionally, gain access to educational institutions both in their countries and abroad, which usually have English as like a very primary medium of language, but also they don't prove at all why like prioritizing English like repudiates and like neglects other languages. We gave you this analysis about how even if you teach English as a primary language in institutions, that does not mean that other languages get neglected. The reason for this is in most developing countries, in all developing countries, native languages will still be the primary mode of communication for you when you talk to your family, when you talk to your friends during lunch breaks, when you talk outside. The only thing that we're going to change here is that English is going to be the primary medium, which means that you're going to have much more emphasis on English than you have in the status quo. They don't prove to us how they take away the culture idea as well, how you're erasing cultures. But the second idea about culture, they said that they were erasing native cultures and that we're doing a very bad job here because cultures are an expression of language. We think not necessarily. culture is only valuable when you have a choice to opt in or opt of that culture, right? We don't think language is the only way that culture can be expressed, and culture will be expressed anyway, because we don't take a policy that tells you, look, Urdu or Hindi or Bengali or any other native language is like more inferior than other languages. We only tell you that it's going to be the primary mode of communication. But also, they don't mechanize how they're going to solve the culture problem here, right? They don't tell you how we're going to like do away with cultural problems and what cultural problems it's going to create. They never warrant that at all. But third idea about jobs and the job market. Manuel's initial characterization of developing countries was that two things. One, that there is a large shortage of opportunities in developing countries, which means there's a large amount of people competing for the jobs in white collar that primarily prioritize English, but also there's a very saturated market where a limited amount of people who have the privilege to learn English at private colleges or really good or really good primary or secondary schools have the monopoly over these jobs because millions of other students in the country don't have access to English. What does this look like realistically? Realistically, what this looks like is that students from low income or bad schools or any school that doesn't prioritize English as the primary medium, even if they're amazingly smart, very good at math, very good at science, it doesn't matter for shit because they won't be able to express these concepts in the language that matters the most, which means that there's an arbitrary, really big barrier for you to get a better job, to get into academia, because the people who you're trying to convince that you are economically valuable and you want social mobility, they don't understand you at all. This means that for interviews in which you are a much more highly qualified applicant than someone who had the privilege of learning English, your resume will be thrown out simply because you couldn't communicate the ideas as well. And the reason for the lack of communication is because you weren't taught this, because of the chance of birth, because there were constraints placed upon you at your very birth. But also, we tell you that globally, there's a much larger opportunity that you have. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from closing.
So can you please mechanize for us why, given that this discrepancy already exists within developing nations, why then you should force these students who, for conditions beyond their control, cannot learn English, why then forcing them into this sort of like system?
We think the benefits that we provided to you in our first prop speech and also right now are really, really obvious. Better life outcomes, better material outcomes, more cultural connectivity because you can represent your country on a higher plane, but also more access to academia and like better universities, right? The reason me or Manuel or like many ESL speakers are here in the US from their countries is because the primary language of instruction was English, right? The reason I'm able to debate today and millions of students in Pakistan are not even able to get out of the poverty line is that they didn't have this. And because of the very like stark benefits and the three characterizations that we gave to you in this speech, first, why English is the one language that should be done because it's like lingua franca and it's vital for opportunities all across the world. Secondly, why it should be the primary language because it's not given enough importance and it doesn't cancel out other languages. And lastly, why in developing countries specifically because they can benefit from the instruction of this language the most. We give you a unique characterization that will be important from the get-go to the very end of this debate. For that reason, very proud to propose.
Yep, I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Let's have that yellow whenever they are ready. Shasha.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. I would prefer POIs in the chat if that's possible. Thank you. Okay, let's start with the question of whether or not English is a necessary thing within the expansion of the free market and just in general the global politics for you to actually succeed. Let's actually presume that people have the ability to actually have an interview with an international firm that is going to be like for this individual and like whether or not they're going to be given certain examples because of English. Panel, recognize one. English is not as fluent in every single country of the free and developed world as it is seen. It is literally only like Canada, just North America, some European countries. But for example, in the Netherlands, you can't really be extremely successful without actually knowing Dutch in the first place. In France, there's requirements that you learn French. It's not like English is a free-for-all in every single scenario. It is a minority language at best if you want to go outside of these things. Secondly, let's look at whether or not these things are actually expressive in certain specific situations. That is to say, is learning specifically math English useful for you to actually be able to, example, practice more, as they've illustrated, for you to be able to communicate these things more? Probably, I would say not. Two main reasons. One, because it's not possible that from the ability for me to understand geometry in English, that I'm going to perceive English as any other thing than actually schoolwork. I don't understand the link coming from that perspective. But secondly, I don't understand that these teachers are actually going to be able to effectively communicate in English and actually teach me geometry for me to be able to be successful at geometry and math, which I would argue is extremely more important comparatively than me being able to learn English. That is to say, at the point at which I'm a programmer and a company is willing to hire me to be a programmer, I don't have to be fluent in English and understand Shakespeare. Rather, I need to be a good programmer, something that doesn't require English in the first place. You just have to be good at programming. At the point at which you're taught better, it is better on our side of the house. Now, let's look at the quality of instruction on a comparison even more. First thing I would like to note is that, sure, rich people have access to learning English and poor people don't. What does this mean? What this means on their side of the house is not that suddenly poor people are not going to be able to get certain jobs, but rather that poor people are less likely to be able to follow in class and thus are going to be less successful in school. Panel, recognize that grades are something extremely important when it comes to, for example, university applications, or for you to be eligible in certain jobs. At the point at which this is true, this creates a larger disparity between the poor and the rich, rather than the idea that you're going to be learning English on a comparative. And panel, recognize that university specifically the way that you actually go away from these blue-collar jobs that OG actually cares so much about. At the point at which this is true, we uniquely provide a benefit in which poor people actually have the ability to go to university that is going to be successful in leading them to a better life. Secondly, recognize that poor neighborhoods are also going to be less successful in teaching children English. That is to say, at the point at which this is true, and structural classism is a thing, people are going to be less successful even in those scenarios at the point at which teachers are going to be forced to teach in a language that they're not actually proficient in. Thus, there's going to be a higher disparity. Poor people are going to be less able to actually do anything. That is to say, it doesn't matter if I'm going to be able to perform better in an interview, if I'm not going to be able to show up to that interview because they're not going to even consider me at the point at which I don't have a university degree that actually matters. Okay, let's move on to this culture point that they've completely washed out simply because it's not important. Now, panel, recognize that language is something that is actually important within the culture. That is to say, it is something that is inherently tied to understanding of our identities and something that is important. Simultaneously, recognize that at the point at which something is a primary language of instruction, it says that this is something that is more important in the wider culture of society. Recognize how this makes you feel about your own culture and how you understand your own society in that case scenario. You get a feeling of inferiority and you don't understand your own understanding to compare to the society. That is to say, you see English as the solution. You see something that the only way for you to succeed is to wash down your cultures on a comparative. Panel, recognize that also the only negation that they actually engaged with on the principle was that now we're disabling these people to actually take the tools of English on a comparison. Panel, recognize English was a prevalent thing because of colonialism, and if they're answering that from the perspective that the principle should be that we're giving them English back, that doesn't inherently work because English is not going to be funded by England. That doesn't really function in that case scenario. I don't know if that makes sense, but principally, if you look it up, doesn't really wash down when compared to the actual principle. At the point at which this is true, we say that we're more likely to be preserving old culture. At the point at which we don't create a feeling of inferiority against it. At the point at which we don't show them that they're less than, that they should wash down their things down. And panel, recognize that this is an extremely important part of this entire case. Why is that so? Because at the point at which you claim that you should be taking away any part of yourself for you to be more successful in society, it is literally just whitewashing your own identity. It is literally just whitewashing your own culture. That is to say, by the logic that you should change yourself for your success in our society, and that not only that, but that institutionally this should be encouraged, essentially means that you should also change other parts of your culture, because it is more likely that you will be more successful if you appear to be, for example, Christian and things like that. This is, I would say, principally inherently wrong. And the point at which this is true, I don't think it justifies it any sort of scenario. At the point at which language is an important part of our culture, we shouldn't take it away. Before moving on, I will take closing. Opening.
Panel, I think that for this debate to become parted, we obviously assume that over time the schools become more capable in like hiring people or teaching more teachers how to teach in English. But I think that the comparative is then their lack of engagement with the fact that you still learn your own language, so you have the best of both worlds through talking to like outside of school.
Okay, thank you. Like two things with that. One, I don't understand how these things will actually get better over time, because there's currently not the best teachers in schools. That is to say, something coming from your own characterization, that is to say, people don't see English as taught seriously currently. So there's probably not a lot of math teachers that are probably actually able to teach you English. Simultaneously, I'm pretty sure poor neighborhoods are not going to be funded to actually teach a lot of math teachers on a comparison. Actually, I will continue with this and actually add a principal layer to our argumentation and claim that recognize that what they're proposing is putting more money into colonizing their own country and going against their own core principles. That is to say, you're putting a burden to your own home country to put a lot of money to fund your teachers to be better at English, for you to take down a lot of the part and importance of our culture. This is also another layer. Secondly, let's look at the point about how you're still fostering your things. Recognize how this ignores our idea of like how you feel an inferiority towards other cultures. That is to say, at the point in which you put something as a primary language, your language is obviously going to be secondary. That is to say, the perception of people is going to be that your language is not something that matters in society, and thus you're not going to be able to do certain things. But secondly, like I'm pretty sure that like this also goes both ways. That is to say, like at a point in which only one of your subjects is going to be your own language, they're probably going to be a hindrance of your own language in the long term. That is to say, your conversation at best case scenario is going to say that you're going to be less likely to converse in your own language rather in English because it's more chatty. For all these reasons, I beg you to vote O.
Yep, I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. That marks the end of the opening half debate. To start with the closing half, let's have the member of comment whenever they are ready.
Cool. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I have my phone elsewhere. Sorry. Give me a second. Great. POIs in the chat, please. Yeah. Cool. My speech started in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 clarifications. 1, I think 2 languages can coexist at the same time. We point you towards Hong Kong and Singapore who correctly transition, who accurately transition their school life into English, but still maintain their local language. Why is that the case? It is the case exactly because of what O tells you, because their language is so ingrained in their culture. They talk in their houses, perform their rituals in their original language, and they see English as a business and workplace language that they can use to conceptualize their rights and conceptualize their business opportunities. And therefore coexistence makes sense. 2, why English? It is just because it's a maximum utility. I think English is the most popular language in the world. It's also decently easy to learn compared to Spanish, etc. I don't exactly think implementation and this will be a problem in this debate. If anything, white man's burden software, because a lot of missionaries will go there and teach them. Cool. 3 extensions then. That gets at the cross of what the debate probably should be about. 1, the diffusion of information. This comes in 2 parts. A lot of the times in your own traditional language, it's extremely hard to conceptualize different rights that do not exist in languages prior to the development of thought. For example, feminism does not exist inside the Chinese dictionary until the past 10 years. Therefore, it is extremely hard for other languages to conceptualize the changes in ideologies without the words in which you can say that. But even if hypothetically individuals can conceptualize what those means and therefore by and large ask for their rights, they have no ability to vocalize and to broadcast their ideas. For example, it is extremely hard for you to raise a flag to say that we should have more female rights in a lot of places because of the fact that those words do not exist. And therefore, using the language, i.e. English, as a language and a medium for you to conceptualize your rights and vocalize your beliefs is extremely important because you have more information as such. Two, there's diffusion of ideas. There's a reason why authoritarian figures and dictators, and the first thing they do is often to block translation and block books. The reason is the capacity for foreign ideas to fuse into the country makes them lose hold of what the country is and what the people believe in. But the moment in which individuals have autonomy over what to read, i.e. English being a liberal language that people can access and have a lot of thoughts, different ideas and thoughts into it, individuals would have the capacity to understand more ideas and more thoughts that are beneficial to them. It is extremely easy to block translators inside your countries. It is extremely hard to block TikTok and the diffusion of ideas through that way. Why is this probably important? It is important because you can teach math, you can teach coding, but you cannot teach what feminism is unless you have those words inside your ideas. And it's extremely hard to wage against authoritarian figures or just any countries at large who are against these kind of progress and to put those words into their original language. And therefore the adoption of English is best to achieve those needs. Secondly, on the ideas of constitutional, on the ability for you to garner rights. I think what the opening debate misses is the idea that, cool, just because you're in the same country doesn't mean people speak the same language. A lot of the time, inside the same country, a lot of people speak different languages. This comes in two reasons. One, borders are drawn arbitrarily by colonial regimes, points towards Africa for examples. Second, a lot of the time, Western countries will prevent collaboration between these countries, just based on the fact that if they have the same language and can communicate in the same way, they will come together and go against the West at large. And therefore, West uses language to control individuals. Why exactly is the language, like the language discrepancy, extremely problematic within the countries? It is because of the fact that language is often dominated by the majority group within the countries, i.e. look at Iraq, for example. That therefore means that minorities have no way to understand the political system, ask for their rights, participate in political processes, and defend themselves in judicial hearings. All those means that they have no capacity to defend themselves against the state that has monopoly over the violence. But it secondly also means that other groups have no capacity to understand them, because the fact that they speak a different language, have different thoughts, different rituals and communities, it means that other groups can never be involved in those kind of situations and bring empathetic lights towards them. That creates a horrible problem because there will be an in-group, out-group situation. Why does English solve? English solve because it's an impartial language. It gives two things to these people. One, the capacity for individuals to uniquely have unique claim to knowledge that are irrespective of the majority and minority dynamics within the countries. Because now you do not have to acclimate into acclimate into the majority language in order to know the knowledge, because the majority of the literature in those countries are written in those languages, and that is particularly problematic. But two, you also don't need to ascribe to those kind of language to be part of the political system. When a minority leader wants to rise up in these type of countries, it is particularly hard. Why? Because they cannot do so if they don't speak the majority language. But if they speak the majority language, they'll often be shut out by their minority regimes. There's also emboldened nationalistic figures to use language as a norm by silencing out minority groups and saying that they are inferior and not prevalent to these countries. Why does this tie into the debate in the developing world? It does, because developing worlds are structured this way. The reason why they are developing is because Western countries go in and arbitrarily decide political system and oftentimes language for themselves, and therefore it is extremely prevalent. What is weighing on this? One, internal conflicts like this often comes before technological and economic progress because they have to take precedence. But two, we should care about the equality of distribution within the same country because the dynamics within the countries are important. Before that, then,
I don't recognize that a lot of these arms are symmetrical on your side of the house. That is to say, the point at which there is a utility metric for English to exist is going to become a lingua franca. For example, in Nigeria, this happens. Simultaneously, the Hindu and
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Like, the point is that it's a third-party language, and the majority leader and the majority party cannot dominate and marginalize the minority group. When there's a third-party language that is, everyone has an equal claim because it's equally hard for everyone, and therefore the majority cannot hold a stand on it. Third extension then, opening wants to talk about, technological changes and ability for you to shift economic progress. I think they get at the wrong link. Why do we uniquely provide you a link? Developing countries are characterized by a manufacturing-based economies. The reason is not because they are not smart, but because of the Western countries and companies that dominate world economics do not give them opportunities. Because they see them as, one, uncivilized, right? That's what they see them as, uneducated, because they cannot communicate with them in a common language they can use. But two, they cannot transfer knowledge to them. That is to say, they do not have the capacity to understand English thoughts that are oftentimes written in these companies' rule books. Why does that change? Because the moment in which English becomes the language that everyone uses in these countries, companies have the incentive to move in. They can move into capitalize on the cheap labor, but also the educated workforce, and therefore more job opportunities will be created. But not just more job opportunities, more creative opportunities, because now they will not only be seen as production machines, but rather they're seen as people who can articulate their thoughts and their ideas, and therefore they will have more creative capacity inside the countries. For those reasons, then, I'm so proud to stand on closing government.
I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we have the member of opposition whenever they are ready? Sure, you can keep your camera off. That's it.
Okay, confirm I'm audible.
Indeed, you are audible.
Thank you. Okay. Great. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think at the point in time at which the minority groups can effectively integrate into mainstream and get value, when they can only achieve that kind of integration when they're able to speak English. We don't think that kind of integration, that kind of acceptance is purely ideological, purely based on the fact that the reason why they're minorities in the first place is because most of the ideologies they value, most of the ideologies they hold are ideologies that are strike down and none is valid for them. We don't get sufficient analysis from to prove as to why the moment these individuals are able to speak English and effectively relate with everyone in society, that kind of integration and acceptance as a minority is solely based on the fact that you've got your own ideology that we buy into, that we value, or it's simply based on the fact that you speak English, that's you're able to relate with the majority populace and you don't think you deserve the minority status. But secondly, when they say, oh, we think some ideals can only be defined in English, and that is why they become meaningful. And when they give us the example of how things like feminism didn't exist in the Chinese context, right? We think when you then have to use English to define these toxic ideologies, you've got less of an incentive to engage that ideology in its native form. We think what English simply does in this case is it simply becomes a translation of this particular ideology, but does not dive much in more to the ideological backing up of that particular engages that idea internalize again to prove as to why the incentive to then dive into the native aspect of it when they've simply chosen to translate it and even solve that problem based on the Western view, the Western liberal view, which is completely different from the ideology that define the Chinese culture or whatever kind of culture which you think needs to translate their toxic ideals before it can have value and it can be integrated on societal level. But then again, when you come to OG brings a number of things that we think are already engaged on. But then on the idea of things like how we think we get an equal opportunities from most people in the societies when some people can learn to speak English and others can't speak English. We think these unequal opportunities to exist on their side of the world when most of these individuals who speak English as second language are forced out of their native countries and go and operate in most of the developed countries where they speak English because they're not English speaking individuals. We think it means that at all points in time they're forced to work twice as hard to achieve whatever it is that they can achieve in most of those spaces. We think that very point in time, it essentially means that when we've got more of an incentive to develop the structure within these developing nations, these individuals can flourish in a setup where they don't have to work extremely hard because they simply relate with their native language. When they're forced, when things like brain drain, okay, and they move to most of these developed countries, when these individuals are forced to learn most of this, are forced to learn English as a second language, we think they still have to work twice as hard to achieve whatever it is that the English-speaking individual can achieve. But then we think the idea on how we give individuals a choice is something which you don't necessarily buy into because we think a choice that exists in the future ought to be derived from the fact that they had a choice in the first place to begin with when they were learning that particular language. But to make English a primary language of instruction, number one, you make English, you establish English as the bar, as the bar to measure the kind of relevance an individual has and the intelligence of an individual. That is to say, you set up a number of unrealistic expectations for a number of these individuals, and you don't give them the choice to opt out of that particular language when it comes to learning any kind of when it comes to learning. We think at that point in time, you don't give them the much needed choice when you say the only time you can be relevant and intelligent and valued in this world is when you speak English. We think choice that exists in the future has literally no value when it's simply premised on the fact that you didn't have that choice in the first place. You get the extension from this debate. See, their analysis on why we've got less of an incentive to like to incentive to structurally address the power dynamics that exist in society when disenfranchised people can simply compromise and opt into this English language. But two, we get an extension on show to show why we think most developing countries exist in this current state because of like prehistoric systems of colonialism and current systems of neocolonialism, and why we entrench this further when we actively promote like English being learned in most of the states. And then you get like an extension to prove to you why we think why we think like things like such as discrimination that exists within most of these spaces that even go as far as people having to achieve anything. It's something which I think is more likely to exist when you make English the primary instruction in most of the states. Firstly, on why we think things power dynamics are less likely to be engaged. Our opening gives analysis to say we think most culture like derives its value from the ability to be interpreted in its native form. And without that, and when that is diluted, it means people lose their identity. To extend on this, like from CO, we say at the point at which these people lose their identity, we don't think that's the only thing that they lose. The reason why most groups identify as ethnic minorities or are not valued as much in society, it's simply because we've got like an overriding norms or an overriding contract that is more important than theirs. When English becomes like the most valued language within the state, and most of these cultural ideologies are interpreted in English, it means that the native ideals lose value. Why is this problematic? It means we push most of these cultural groups into an echo chamber where their ideology is not fully represented, but secondly, it's not represented in its most meaningful form. This therefore means that any kind of value that exists for that particular ideology is greatly struck down upon. The biggest problem that exists is that they don't just lose their identity, but the kind of representation that they can get as a cultural group that has been pushed into an echo chamber and is even more vulnerable, that kind of representation that they can get in a state that defines its progressive structures based on foreign languages is minimal. The impact of this big panel is that there's less of an incentive to even structurally address those kind of power dynamics in the state where most of these individuals don't get the proper representation they need, simply because number one, you've pushed them into an echo chamber, and the only point at which their ideology and their cultural value can hold relevance is if it's interpreted into an English language, which is something that CG varies for. We think at that point in time, you don't get absolute representation for these groups that are struck down upon. But the second bit of analysis from CO is to say the reason why most of these developing countries are in this state is because of one, prehistoric exploitation through systems like colonialism, that like prehistoric oppression through systems like colonialism that siphon resources from the states, but to modern day neocolonialism that is still exploitative and is siphoning resources. The biggest problem is that this exploitation is more likely to flourish and exist when you like push for this kind of policy. Why? One, it means like we're overshadowed by the Western ideology and indoctrinated into believing that we can only flourish if we exist in that setup. Two reasons why this is true. One, we think any kind of development in these countries is formed on a constant value and glorification of the Western construct. But two, we set up standards like and structures that require us to constantly engage with the West if we're ever to get any kind of development in these countries. We think at that point in time, these countries exist in a space where they're overshadowed by most of the states. We don't think that like open government teams do a good job in like engaging like countries that have managed to make it and flourish like in terms of economic and political structures when they use their native language. I think countries like China and countries like India have managed to gain traction and relevance without necessarily like overshadowing their own language with English and making it the primary instruction. We think this means that at the point at which most of these developing countries constantly exist under the shadow of this kind of oppression, they don't get the kind of development, the kind of integration they need. They systematically exist in the world, but there's an intrinsic value for that neocolonialism and exists on an even more integrated form when we don't give these individuals a platform to develop like through having an intrinsic value for their own culture. We're so proud to oppose.
I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we have the government whip whenever they are ready, Shasha?
Hi, just confirming audibility.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. I'd prefer PLIs in the chat. Thank you. Panel, a piece of clarification in terms of just the framing before I go on to talk about the major clashes. Note that opening opposition comes up with this framing that, English is not that important anyways, or it's losing importance since only a few countries use it. So I would say that they underestimate the number of people who speak English. We think that the numerical quantity in and of itself is not the metric of valuing importance, right? It's the fact that these few countries like the US, China, some countries in Europe, these control most of the global economy that we see today. And thus that creates the importance of learning English because we want these developing countries to connect to that increasing globalization. And that's the main way we can access it, right? By teaching English and using it as a primary language of instruction in these schools. So onto the two classes then. Firstly, how does this actually impact societal values? And then secondly, how does this impact learning and globalization? So firstly, on the societal values, what did OpBench tell us? From opening up, told us that, language is very important to culture is important. CO kind of jumps on this as well. A few things. Firstly, we don't disagree that culture is important, right? We do think it's important, but note that OP actually has to prove you lose that culture, right? We don't think that you only have to speak your native language to retain its importance in your life, because you get that importance when you talk to your family, when you talk to people outside of school, right? When you talk to just interact with regular members of the community. As a result, you never stop speaking your language, which OO claims, nor do you fall into any of the echo chambers that CO tries to claim as well. But secondly, we think that when you're introduced to like a new foreign language, which in this case would be English, you actually value and cherish your native language more, because you start to see the distinctions in terms of how people express thoughts. We think that, for instance, when some things in your language can't be expressed in English and vice versa, you start to notice, oh, that's why my language is special, etc. But thirdly, note that CO talks about the particular harms of being westernized as a result of learning this kind of English. We just don't think it's particularly harmful when you access the benefits of learning this English and also retain your native benefits by communicating with people in your in your surroundings. Secondly, O comes up with this triangle argumentation that only the privileged would be educated. Well, we kind of disagree with this, right? Because as English becomes the primary language of instruction, that means that those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged that go to those schools, right, will still have a more level playing field compared to the alternative of not having that as all, right? Because the comparative is you having English as the foreign language being taught. And I think our opening already provides you sufficient evidence that when English is the foreign language being taught and not the primary one, you don't retain that level of like understanding of English versus the vice versa comparison. We think that takes out O there. But then next O comes up and says like, well, you're going to devalue your own language, right? Again, very simple rebuttal. I think that outside of your school, your native language is still the most common, still the most important, right? When your country hosts events, when you talk to people on the street, etc., all these are interactions of your own language. So what do we bring to this class uniquely from our bench? Firstly, we told you that, as a liberal language, English allows the conceptualization and vocalization of different rights and ideologies. We gave you the feminism example, right? We think that English allows for the spread of ideas for you to counter things that are more authoritarian in your home country. The only kind of pushback we do get from this extension is from CO when they said that, there might be some sort of resistance, but we think that the weighing here is pretty simple. We think that people recognize the potential of these social movements to access liberal ideas, and these liberal ideas are by definition more inclusive of people in community. So we think we can probably get that support we need. But CO also argues like a Western view of the ideologies will persist, right? But three things. Firstly, we think the point is that you have the ability to share ideologies, and that exists in the first place. But secondly, we think that when these ideologies are articulated by these people who live in their own native country, they will incorporate their native ideas to fit in, right? Because I think thirdly, when you want to gain support for these ideologies, you want to connect to people who are around you. And the best way to connect is to use strands of thoughts that are similar to what you've learned before, but also incorporate that new progressive ideologies. And that's why we think we uniquely mechanize this kind of solution on our bench. But the weighing here is really simple, right? We allow for changes down the line. That is something that OpBench does not at all. On to the second class then. How does this impact learning and globalization? Opening op says that, teachers will do a bad job, students won't learn well. Firstly, notice that in the counterfactual, people who have been learning English at a very young age, we think these harms are already largely mitigated. But secondly, in a lot of things for you to find like more economic abilities, such as like the STEM field, we think English is not a huge requirement for understanding in terms of the technical aspects, because in English related fields, that's where they need that kind of understanding. And we think the teachers there will probably have the fluency requirements to teach this kind of English, right? So we think people will still understand English when their teachers teach it. Then OO comes in and says that, you'll get less job opportunities because you're like not a mix, you're not learning your native language. Firstly, we think you probably get more jobs because you now have an additional asset in your toolbox that makes you stand out to employers, right? We think that being at least bilingual allows you to connect different people together. And this impact note, it applies to both to people looking for jobs in their native country and outside their country because they have that bilingual capacity. But secondly, just because the fact that school teaches in a different language doesn't mean that the education itself is bad, right? We see that a bunch of people still try to get their kids a US education where English is a medium of instruction. This is because they equate the ability of learning English in these schools to increase connections and career potential after graduation. Similarly, after you have English as a primary medium of instruction in your native country, you're still more likely to have these connections and career potentials. We say that this education will be valued. Before going on to the last point, I'll take a POI from opening.
Recognize how you've never responded to our point about how just in general education is likely to be worse, specifically in poorer areas that cannot afford teachers to be proficient in English enough to teach you math.
We think that when you have that ability to learn English, that is the starting point that we provide, right? That starting point is something that OP never has. We think at the very minimum, we get that marginal benefit. Lastly, OO says that, one last point rebuttal is that they have a worse chance of development. In terms of brain drain, notice the tension between this and saying you can't find a job in other countries. Secondly, we think a counterfactor is not brain drain, but companies coming in. I think my partner already proved it when he told you about how we improve perception of these developing countries and how that translated to companies moving in to capitalize on a workforce that can communicate and people who can articulate and communicate their thoughts. But thirdly, even if there was initial brain drain, it actually takes more like transferability of knowledge, because it's more likely people come back to your native country and at least share that kind of knowledge, or at least send money back, etc., for developments. This is good because you bring things like new innovation, new discourse, etc. Lastly, something really important about this class is that we told you explicitly that the West uses language to hold a power asymmetry over developing countries, right? It's very important for people in these developing countries to be able to defend themselves against this encroaching power by learning this language and mitigating the in-group, out-group bias, right? In our world, you no longer have a claim to knowledge. No longer does only the foreigners who speak English have this claim to knowledge, because now these people in developing countries also know English, and everyone has an equal claim to language in our world. This means that English as a learning, when it takes precedence as a prereq to accessing these other benefits, we as CG are the only side that can access these benefits down the line. Very proud to propose.
Yep, I would thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we have the opposition whip to end the debate whenever they are ready, Shasha?
Good afternoon, morning once again. It's your boy Charles, and just before I start, I'd like to give a special shout out to the University of Rochester and also to Royalty Park Debate Academy, and to all that have made it possible for me to be here at this point. In terms of POI preferences, I'll be taking them after the 5th minute. Unmute yourself and say POI, and then I'll be taking you. Especially encourage the opening teams to ask POIs for purposes of engagement. And yeah, confirm I'm still audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, if the LGBTQ were willing to compromise and throw away their identity, we think there will be less of a structural incentive for us to establish structures for the LGBTQ because they're willing to compromise anyways, right? We think there exists a thing of power dynamics whereby there is the West versus the global South, right? And we think that power dynamics, we should have an incentive to take it down. However, in the event that the minorities, people from the global South, are willing or they are forced to compromise, we think there is less of an incentive to therefore establish structural changes to actually address that problem, right? We think because it already comes here with so much nuance when it tells you about the prehistoric injustices that have led to the point where we are right now. The idea how there will be more exploitation at the point at which we are overshadowed by these Western constraints, right? Now, look at the response that you get from Sichi that, well, at the point at which you value English, that means that you also value your culture more because you say, this is what is different in my culture, this is what is different in English. False. Panel. At the point at which you see English as this metric that like measures success, we think you are less likely to see your culture as being equally important. There is less of an incentive for you to protest because you think that for you to be well off in life, you need these Western ideologies, you need these Western constraints. We think this is something that is regrettable and something we will not accept in today's debate, right? So in terms of clashes, right, what do we get really? Okay, I will do this in an integrated manner. Firstly, we get the idea of the principle from OG, right? Where they tell us that people shouldn't be constrained into positions where they've been born into and hence they should be allowed to move. Panel, we think this sounds intuitively right, but then understand that this, at the point at which these countries such as the USA, such as Britain, are only cherry picking and willing to take a few individuals who have shown to be experts in this particular field, we think it is principally wrong for us to actually allow that process to occur. Why? Because it is the people that do not have these skills or that do not know enough English that will be disenfranchised. Meaning to say, if Charles wanted to go to the US because he isn't as good as the next person, he will not be accepted. We think this on a principle is wrong and something that is morally abhorrent, something that the government can unfortunately not defend, right? But then also, panel, we think that at a point at which we encourage this English, there will be more brain drain, right? Why? Because the people, there's that belief that I have to learn English so that I can move away, right? We think that our opening already does enough about that, right? But then also we think that on the point of like equity about which side has more opportunities, which side has more equality. Panel, understand that at a particular point in time in the status quo, we think that the people or the minorities, the people that are poor in those countries are the ones that are less likely to know English anyways, right? We think there exists a discrepancy between the English that I speak as someone from a low income family and the English that is spoken by someone from a high income family. So at the point at which you use English as a metric to evaluate, we think that you perpetuate inequality within those countries, right? Why? Because it already tells you on the ideas about how within those countries, now you'll be seen as less of a student because you cannot speak that English as well as the next student, right? Why then is this bad? One, there is discrimination from the teachers themselves because it already tells you about how then this perpetuates the ideas of bullying because your English is not as good as mine. We think this is something that is bad and something that you shall not tolerate this debate, right? But then thirdly, it's on the ideas of culture, right? We hear this ludicrous argument that there is better culture from the side of government, right? Understand, panel, that this perpetuates ideas of white supremacy, right? Our opening opposition assess this and by saying that there will be white supremacy and English supremacy. But then this is why I mechanize it, right? We say one, we think that education is seen as the key to success. And when we tie education to English, right? We are essentially saying that English is the key to success, and you being less of an English speaker are bound to be less successful. You with your cultural African values are bound to be less successful, right? We think this is something that is bad and something that we regret into this motion, right? But then just a POI.
Opening.
Yep.
Panel, we win the point of identity with the argument that goes completely clean in all four speeches, which is that you can exponentiate your own culture when you know English, particularly when we know that this is not only you accessing the United States or England, but that it is a universal language where regions can grow stronger together. No addressment to this.
We think this is false. We think the reason why I'm speaking in English right now and not speaking in Ndebele is because of this idea that I have to speak in English, right? We think that there is less of an incentive for me to actually expatiate this culture of mine knowing that the metric under which I'll be evaluated is English, right? If I was to start speaking in Ndebele right now, that would be bad. We think this is something that is disingenuous from that side of the house. Then from the closing government, we had the idea about ideologies, about how feminism cannot be expressed in these native cultures. Panel, notice how they do not mechanize why feminism cannot exist within these cultures. We think that there is the value of Ubuntu within the African context, right? We think such values do exist and think that feminism can exist, even if it's not called feminism, it can exist in a different form, like in a different way, right? We think this is something that is important, right? But then thirdly, we did the idea of minorities. I think this is something that debaters now do. They throw in minorities and then they expect to win the round. Panel, understand that from side closing government, you hear the idea that minorities cannot defend themselves when there is a monopolies of language by like these predominantly language, whatever, right? Panel, understand that as a minority, when English is used to evaluate you, that means that you face twice the hurdle. That means that as you pursue justice, one, you first have to learn English well enough for you to be able to represent yourself. This is something that is bad. Why? Because now you cannot pursue justice in your own language in the way that you understand it. However, you first have to learn English first before you pursue your justice. So we think as a minority, you are less incentivized to pursue justice at a point in time in which your pursuit of justice will be evaluated on one, whether your pursuit of justice is good, but then second, how good enough your English is, right? This is something that is bad. We think that if you were to ask me to defend myself in Chinese, I would fail miserably, right? Even if I had a point. Why? Because of that language discrepancy, something that is bad. But then what does Nkosi tell you with regard to minorities? Nkosi talks to you about the idea of the existence of power dynamics, right? The idea that the West is better than the South, and that there is less of an incentive to actually combat those power dynamics at the point at which the minorities are being forced to actually compromise and like become more Western, right? We think this is something that is regrettable. We think that English will always be valued above all the other languages, not because it is objectively good or there is no morally arbitrary reason for us to value English above all the other subjects. We think that it is valued above all the other languages because of the idea that English is more valuable. We think that we need to combat such ideas. We think that France, we think that China were able to actually develop even outside of English. So I don't see why then English needs to be the metric of success, or why then English needs to be the way in through only which we can succeed, right? But then also, in terms of what Nkosi tells you, Nkosi talks to you about the idea of choice. Why now there is no incentive, or why you cannot opt in, opt out, because now you're as valuable as the English that you speak. We think this is something that is bad, given that these people have already been disenfranchised by history time and time again, and how this leads to more exploitation. So proud.
I would thank that speaker.